And this weekend we're talking together about Genesis chapter 28. And Genesis 28, it focuses in on the life of Jacob. In Genesis chapter 28, we find that God, he meets Jacob right where Jacob's at, in the middle of Jacob's messes and his sin and his depravity and his dysfunction. And when God meets Jacob right where he's at, then God goes with Jacob from that point forward. God goes with Jacob from that point forward. And what we find from Genesis chapter 28 is that the same thing can be true for us today. That God, when he meets with us in his grace, finding us right where we're at, then God, what he does is he goes with us from there. God graciously meets us where we are and then goes with us from there. We'll see it from Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 through 22. Starting in verse 10, Jacob left Beersheba and he set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. And taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and he lay down to sleep. And he had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And there above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I'm with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, and I will not leave you until I've done what I have promised you. And when Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. Jacob was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone that he had placed under his head and he set it up as a pillar and he poured oil on top of it and he called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. And then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey that I'm taking and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God. This stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And of all that you give me, God, I will give you a tenth of it back. Now, what happens with Jacob in those verses is that God meets Jacob when Jacob least expects it. Jacob is not looking for God. He is not searching for God. But God meets with Jacob, even when Jacob did not expect to meet with God in this moment. And sometimes that's how God works. Sometimes God shows up at the most unexpected moments. For the past 2 weeks, I have been on paternity leave, hanging out with my wife and our 2 kids now. And let me tell you, I've had some moments over the past 2 weeks that turned into unexpected God moments. Because who would have guessed that diaper duty was a good time to meet with Jesus? Or who would have guessed that when you are rocking your child back to sleep at 2 a.m. was a good time to meet with Jesus? I'll tell you this, over the past 2 weeks, there was one night in particular that I remember where I think it was about 4 a.m., and we were 4 diapers in a 30-minute window. 4 changed diapers in a 30-minute window. And I was not expecting to meet with God during that moment. I was a little frustrated during that moment, but you better believe, let me tell you, that my daughter and myself and we had a come to Jesus meeting. All 3 of us sat down and talked for a minute about 4 diapers at 4 a.m. in a 30-minute window. And like, don't get me wrong, there was one night where I slept through one of the feedings and I was in trouble. I was not scoring any points there. But what I've found is that over the past couple of weeks, there have been moments where I did not expect to meet with God, but I was able to do so. And all diaper jokes aside, moments when I'm rocking my kid back to sleep at 2 a.m. and I'm praying over them or speaking God's word over their life, or moments where I get to hold my kid and I don't want to put him down, and I'm just awed by the fact that I get to be a dad. Those moments are moments that I didn't expect, where I got to meet with God. And one of my very good friends, very wise friend, he told me recently that all those dads who they brag about maybe not having to change any diapers. I never changed a diaper once. Or those dads who say that I never got up in the night with my kid. All those dads who brag about those things, those are the dads that they missed it. They missed those moments that they could have had with their kids. And sometimes, like I said, that's how God works. God shows up when we don't expect him to. God shows up in moments that we might not have even been looking for him in. And that's exactly what happens to Jacob. God shows up with Jacob. He shows up to Jacob. He meets Jacob right where he's at. And then God goes with Jacob from that point forward. And if we followed Jesus for very long, we probably know what this is like. In fact, maybe that's part of the reason that we follow Jesus. Maybe part of the reason we follow Jesus is because God showed up when we least expected it. Maybe we were in some kind of financial crisis, or we found out that we'd come down with a debilitating sickness. And what happened was maybe God stepped in and he provided financially, or God stepped in and he provided healing. And when he did, maybe that's part of the reason that we put our faith in him. Or maybe our story is a little bit like Jacob's, where we've been far from God and we are running from God and we are running from our past and we are not seeking God or wanting anything to do with him. And what does God do? We hit rock bottom and nobody else is around and we're using a rock for a pillow. That's how homeless and alone we are. What does God do? God shows up and he meets us where we're at and he goes with us from there. Or maybe for us, maybe our marriage is in trouble. Right? Maybe it looks like our family's going to fall apart, but then God steps in and he helps us redeem and he helps us reconcile that relationship. And now on the other side of it, we see that God, he brought us through it. That God, he met us where we were at in a moment where we didn't expect him to, and he brought us through it. Or maybe, this might be the case for more of us than we'd like to admit, but maybe none of those stories sound familiar at all. Maybe we don't know what it's like to have God graciously show up and meet us where we are and then go with us from there. Maybe we have no experience with God showing up in our life. Maybe we're the kind of person that says, God, he doesn't show up for me. God doesn't care about me. And if that is our attitude this morning, then I would challenge and I would encourage us to hang with this text for just a few moments longer, because I believe that by the time we make it to the end of this passage, what we will see is that God, he has shown up for us in an ultimate sense. That God, he has met us where we are at, and he goes with us from there in an ultimate and in a perfect sense. Then this idea that God meets us where we're at, and that he goes with us from there. I love that idea from these verses, because I don't think it's just an idea that we see in this passage. I think it's an idea that characterizes the whole story of Scripture. That God meets us where we're at and goes with us from there. That's the whole story of Scripture. God wanting to be with us and God going to incredibly great lengths to make that happen. That's sort of the big idea in this passage, that God graciously meets us where we are and goes with us from there. And while I believe that this text is all about God and what God does, I believe it's also about how we should respond to what God has done. How should we respond when God meets with us? How should we remember the times when God meets with us? How should we respond to the times and the places where God has met with us? This morning, we're going to take a second look at these verses, and we're going to take a second look at how Jacob remembers, a second look at how Jacob responds. We're going to see how we ought to do the same. What is the right way to respond when God chooses to meet with us? We'll start again in verses 10 through 16. And in the first verses of this chapter, we'll notice what we already said once, is that God, He meets us sometimes in places that we would least expect. When God meets us, sometimes in places and at times when we would not expect for him to be there. Verses 10 through 16, Jacob, he left Beersheba and he set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set, and he took a stone that was there and he put it under his head and he lay down to sleep. And then he had a dream in which he saw a stairway that rested on earth and its top reached into heaven. The angels of God were ascending and descending upon it, and above it stood the Lord. And the Lord said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. I'll give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. And I like that Jacob is lying down during this dream. Like, he doesn't get up during the dream and listen to God. He just stays kicked back with the stone under his head. The land on which you are lying, your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. And I'm with you, and I'll watch over you, and I'll bring you back to this land, and I won't leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Now, when Jacob stops at this place, when Jacob goes out on this journey, Jacob's not looking for God. Jacob is not on some spiritual pilgrimage where he's looking to get to know Jesus better. In fact, if we remember last week, we know why Jacob is sort of on the run. If we remember back to last week, Jacob, at this point, he has not only swindled his older brother Esau out of the birthright, out of what he would inherit as the oldest son, but he has also now swindled his brother Esau out of God's blessing. Remember God's blessing, he said that he was going to give Jacob and his family, or he was going to give Isaac and his family land and descendants. God's blessing, God's promise that was given to them. And Esau would have inherited the birthright and the blessing. But now Jacob has swindled Esau out of both the birthright and the blessing. So that's why Jacob is sort of on the run. He's leaving his home because he's in fear of his life. His brother Esau is likely going to kill him. His brother Esau is likely going to hunt him down and end his life because of what Jacob has done to him. So Jacob, he doesn't set out on this journey to meet with God, but God still meets with him. And when Jacob stops, he doesn't set up camp and decide he's going to build an altar. That's not the point. That's not why Jacob stops. You know why Jacob stops? He stops to camp because night had fallen. It's the only reason that Jacob stops at this point is because he's setting up camp. It's too dark to travel any further. And that is exactly where God meets him, where he least expected, where he's not looking for God, where he's not seeking God or trying to find God. That is where God meets him. And if you think about Jacob's predicament, I think that it's even more impressive that this is where God meets with Jacob. At the lowest point in his life, the biggest crisis that Jacob has probably faced, his own brother looking to end his life, that's where God meets with Jacob. And if we think about his predicament even more deeply, Jacob, he's been given this blessing. Given should be read as stolen, right? He's stolen this blessing from his brother Esau. And what was the blessing? We said the blessing was land and descendants. You're going to have a really big family, and you're going to have lots and lots of land. Big family, lots of land. That's the blessing. That's the promise that now belongs to Jacob. But Jacob, what's Jacob doing? He's leaving Beersheba and he's going back to Haran. I think we have a map of what his journey might have looked like on the screen here behind me. And when Jacob leaves Beersheba and he goes to Haran, it's about 750 kilometers, roughly 550 miles. Pretty serious journey to try to make on foot. Months long that Jacob is going to be journeying from Beersheba back to Haran. And if we pay very close attention to where Jacob is going, we might notice that Jacob is leaving the promised land that Abraham has spent all 28 chapters of Genesis journeying to, and he's going back now to Haran. So he's reversing the promise. All the work that Abraham's put in to get up to here, Jacob's now going back on. It feels like the promise is moving in reverse, and a great deal in reverse, 550 miles in reverse. Think also about the predicament Jacob's in terms of the land. He's not in the promised land anymore. No, he's leaving the land behind. He's leaving the land 550 miles behind. And who is in the land? Well, his brother Esau is still in the land. It looks like Esau has possession of the land. And then what's the other part of that promise? The second part is that Jacob would have a really big family. And why did Jacob's mom and dad send him back to Haran? They sent him back to Haran to go and find a wife, which means that Jacob's not married yet. And it's really hard to have a really big family without a spouse. You can't have children without a spouse. So Jacob, he's going back to find himself a spouse. You know who has a spouse already? You know who has actually multiple wives already? Who has multiple children already? Is Jacob's brother Esau. So Jacob maybe has heard the promise, but surely he does not yet have the promise. And it is at that point precisely where God shows up to Jacob, meets Jacob right where he's at, in the middle of this crisis, and he tells Jacob everything that he needs to hear. What does God say to Jacob? He says, I'm the God of Isaac and the God of Abraham, and I'm going to give you the land that you're lying on. Your descendants are going to be like dust, and they're going to spread out all over the earth to the north and south and east and west, and everybody's going to be blessed through them, and I'm going to watch over you wherever you go. I'm going to bring you back to this land. I'm not going to leave you until I've done what I promised for you. What does Jacob hear? He hears exactly what Abraham heard when God reassured Jacob's grandfather Abraham of the same exact promise. Almost verbatim, the promise that we've heard time and time again in the story of Genesis. When God shows up and he meets Jacob, even though Jacob doesn't expect him to meet there, God shows up and he meets with Jacob in this moment. God tells Jacob everything that he needs to hear. He addresses his fears. He addresses his concerns. He gives him hope for the future. He gives him encouragement. He tells him he's going to go with him and he's not going to be alone. He gives him hope and he gives him faith. He says, I'm going to fulfill all of these promises for you and for your family. When God shows up, sometimes it is when we least expect it. And while that is true, I'm not sure that it's exactly fun for us to find out. Because when we find out that God sometimes, when we see him the clearest and when we feel him most powerfully at work is when we are in a crisis, that's not fun to realize, right? That means that sometimes the hardest points in our lives are the moments where we're going to feel closest to God. I know it's not fun to realize, but I also know that I've experienced that truth in my own life. Because when I was right out of college, just graduated college, and I was starting my career in ministry, I didn't exactly get off to a hot start. I didn't start things out the way that I'd like always dreamed that things would start out for me. So when I first graduated college, I got a job at a small church in rural Missouri. Got a job at a small church in rural Missouri, and it became very clear very quickly that the church's culture, like the staff and the church, the membership, just a very unhealthy church culture. Nothing like New Life Church at all. Nothing like New Life. And I did what I was trying to be wise in doing, and I went to the district youth director, whose job was sort of to help youth pastors in the area stay youth pastors in the area. His job was to make sure that youth pastors stayed in their jobs. And I went to the district youth director, and I was like, hey, things are kind of weird at the church. I want to make sure that like any conflict, I'm out in front of it, like I head it off and I deal with it responsibly and I deal with it the right way. Like I want to keep this job. It's my dream job. And you know what the district youth director told me to do? You know what the guy whose job is to keep youth pastors in their position told me to do? He said, Ryan, I wish you would have come to me before you took the job because I would have told you not to take it. You need to turn in your resignation tomorrow. And I was like, what? Why would I resign from this church? We're just starting to have problems. And the district youth director, he said, Ryan, this church has a pattern of burning through youth pastors and their spouses. They've gone through 7 youth pastors in 7 years. I don't want to see you and Chelsea, who I was engaged to at that point, I don't want to see you and Chelsea get hurt. And so I turned in my resignation letter the very next day. His wife, we had dinner with him, and his wife, she actually looked at me, she said, Ryan, if you don't call them and tell them you're quitting, I'm going to call them and tell them that you're quitting. I was like, okay, so it's pretty serious. So I quit 6 months in, my first position in ministry. What a hot start. Like, man, I am good at being a pastor. And then I got a job as a youth pastor, a part-time youth pastor at another small church, but this time in Springfield. And the church, they couldn't pay me very much money, so I had to eat like dog food for breakfast and lunch and dinner. And then I decided I was going to need to get a second job. Newly married, college degree, can't support my family on what I make in ministry, so I'm getting a second job. And I got a job as a paraprofessional. Okay, so I was a paraprofessional in an elementary school, and I loved that job so thoroughly. I look back on that job, I'm like, man, that was a really cool job. I was a paraprofessional. It means I got to work with students. It means I got to work with special needs students from time to time. And then 2 years into that position, I got promoted, okay? And I was made the recess paraprofessional. And that means that I was in charge of recess. And it was a dream job for every second grader. Every second grader wanted to be me. They thought I was the coolest person on the planet. I got to play kickball with third graders and work on my tan all day long. It was amazing. It was amazing. And all of a sudden, it seemed like teaching made more sense for my life than ministry. My wife, she was a teacher. Could get a job as a teacher. I could make that teacher money. All the teachers, you know what I'm talking about, right? That teacher money. It's actually the teacher retirement. That's why teachers teach. But we'd be on the same schedule. I'd have summers off. Made a lot of sense. And then one day, during a very intense game of kickball with some third graders, 2 teachers, they approached me and they said, hey, Ryan, our church is looking for a youth pastor, and we know that you went to school to be a pastor, and we think you should apply for this position because you're incredible at what you do here at the school. And I never thought that I was going to meet with God during a kickball game with third graders, but those 2 teachers just so happened to go to New Life Church, and they had to be at least 75% of the reason that I got hired for this position. The only reason that I get to stand on a stage with everybody in this room, we get to talk about the Bible together, is because God showed up in a moment where I least expected him to show up. I didn't expect to meet with God when I was doing something for work that I never wanted to do. I didn't expect to be close to God when it felt like I was further away from my goals in ministry than I'd ever been. But I can tell you this, that in the darkest and most difficult season of my time in my career, I've never felt closer to God. Like I love Jesus more today than I think I ever have, but I have never felt God's presence and God's closeness like I did during that season. And I believe it's because God, he shows up when we least expect it. God shows up when we least expect it. When he meets with us, it is sometimes at a point or at a place in our life where we might not be looking or we might not be expecting him to do so. And if we believe that's true, if that really is how God works, if God, in his grace, he meets us where we're at and he goes with us from there. If we really believe that God, he in his grace, shows up when we don't expect it, when we aren't looking for him, when we aren't trying to find, if we really believe that all of that is true, then I think that truth is good news for us no matter our circumstance. Truth is good news for us no matter our circumstance, because if we're in the room this morning and maybe our life is a wreck, dysfunctional is a great word to describe our life. Things are falling apart. We are just like Jacob. We are far from God. We are running from our past. We are swallowed up in sin. If that describes us, the good news is that God meets with people just like that. That God, he meets with people just like us, dysfunctional people. And maybe that doesn't describe you. Maybe you're not dysfunctional. Maybe you are a functional adult and you fit into society, and on the outside you look like you got your life pretty well put together. Maybe that's the case for some of us in the room. But maybe because life is good and things are at peace, maybe we're not seeking God very actively. Maybe we're not seeking God with very much commitment. Maybe we're not trying very hard to get to know Jesus any better. And if that's the case, and if God really does meet us when we least expect, and if God really does meet us where we're at and go with us from there, then how much more could we get to know Jesus better in those moments of peace and in those moments of provision than in those moments of crisis? If God can show up and he can meet us in the middle of a crisis, in the deepest and darkest depravity and dysfunction in our lives, then how much more can God show up in our lives when everything's at peace and when we can focus on him and when we can turn to him and we can truly give him the attention that he deserves? I think what these verses tell us, what the truth from these verses tells us, is that no matter where we stand in life, no matter where we stand in terms of our circumstances, God can meet us where we're at and God will go with us from there. And when God meets with Jacob knows that something important has happened. When God meets with Jacob goes to great lengths to remember what God has done. And the same thing should be true for us, that when God meets with us, it should not be forgotten. When God meets with Jacob makes sure that he is not going to forget that meeting. We see this in verses 16 through 19. Verse 16, when Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob, he took the stone that he'd placed under his head and he set it up as a pillar and he poured oil on top of it and he called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Now Jacob, he goes to great lengths to be sure that he does not forget what God has done. And I think there's probably something to be said from the text about Jacob missing the fact that God was there, not being aware that God was there. Because maybe if we're the kind of person, like we said to start this morning, maybe if we're the kind of person who says, God doesn't show up for me. God doesn't want anything to do with me. If we're that kind of person, if that is maybe our attitude toward God, then maybe we're a little bit like Jacob and we've just missed some of the moments where God shows up in our life. If God could give Jacob this incredible dream, this God moment where God shows up and Jacob says, hey, I missed it. I wasn't aware that God was here. Well then, man, surely we have missed some times where God maybe has shown up in our lives. But if Jacob, if he misses it in the moment, I think that he makes up for it in how he remembers. I think that he makes up for it in how he remembers, because when Jacob wakes up, the first thing that he does is he builds an altar. And what we've seen from the very beginning of Genesis all the way to chapter 28 is that anytime God's people build an altar, what they're doing is they're setting up a memorial to remind them of something God has done. Jacob sets up this memorial to remind him of this place where he has met with God. He sets up this altar. And I also think that Jacob, he does a good job remembering because of his attitude. He goes to great lengths to remember because of his attitude. When Jacob has this meeting with God, it says that Jacob was afraid, and that Jacob says, this place is awesome. This place is awesome. He was afraid, a holy and reverent kind of fear. Not like he's scared of God, maybe a little bit like the same way you'd be scared of a parent, but he also says this place is awesome. And that word for awesome in the original language of the New Testament, it doesn't mean like, this place is cool. This place is really like gnarly or rad. It's not what awesome means. Awesome means that this place inspires awe, and it is fear-inducing. That when Jacob meets with God, it inspires him with awe, and it induces that holy and reverent sense of fear. And because of that attitude, Jacob, he remembers what God has done. And now, Jacob, he goes to such great lengths to remember what God's done because he's good at forgetting. Because pretty much everybody in the story of Scripture is good at forgetting, just like we are good at forgetting. And this is going to make me sound like such a bad dad. But the other day, like 2 weeks, I've been off of work, and I've been figuring out how to parent like 2 kids at once. It's awesome. It's so much fun. But this is going to make me sound like a bad dad because the other day, maybe I'll blame it on dad brain. I don't know. But the other day, I was talking with some friends about my kids' birthdays, and I had to pull up a picture in my phone and look at the time and date stamp on that picture to tell when my son was born. It was really bad. It was really bad. And I only have 2 kids. He's only 2 years old. I'm already forgetting his birthday. Now I haven't forgotten my kids at like the church or like the grocery store yet. I'm sure that is further down the road. That is coming. I will forget them at church at some point, and somebody will have to like save their life and tell them that they're not abandoned. But what I found about parenting 2 kids at the same time is really difficult. And it's something that I didn't see coming that's kind of difficult, is that it's really easy to forget one of the kids when I'm doing something with the other kid. Let me explain a little bit. So when I'm holding my daughter, okay? When I'm holding my daughter, I can't think about anything else. It's like, okay, that's all I need to be doing. Jace could burn down our house. My son, he could burn down our house, and I'd be sitting there staring at my daughter, thinking about how awesome and incredible and beautiful she is. That's what would happen. That's what would happen. And the same thing goes for when I'm playing with my son, Jace. Whenever I'm like wrestling with Jace, when we're playing t-ball, let me tell you, he's really into t-ball right now. Like all things baseball, t-ball, hit the ball, throw the ball. We over the past 2 weeks, we showed my son the Sandlot. Anybody familiar with that? Yeah, it's a great movie. And he's 2, and this is a proud dad moment. He's 2, and he sat through the whole movie just like this because he loved it, because he was so into it. And whenever I'm playing, I believe it was like a core memory for him. I hope it is. In faith, it's going to be a core, like the chewing tobacco scene and the lifeguard scene. Like those are core memories for Jace now. Hopefully, maybe they shouldn't be. But when I'm playing with Jace, or when I'm holding my daughter, sometimes I forget there's another kid there. When I'm wrestling with Jace, I forget there's a baby sleeping in the bassinet. We should probably watch out for when I'm holding my daughter. I forget that Jace, he needs to like have some attention too. And what I've found is that when it comes to parenting 2 kids, I've got to be crazy intentional in terms of the time that I spend with them to make sure that they don't feel forgotten, that they aren't forgotten. And if I can forget 2 living, breathing, whining, crying human children who are always in my face, always needing things, then how much easier is it for us to forget the things that God has done? How much easier is it for us to forget, oh, God met with me there, and he did something in my heart there? How much easier is it it's incredibly easy for us to forget because we are good at forgetting. We are good at forgetting. But Jacob, he goes to great lengths to make sure that he doesn't forget what God has done. For one thing, this place, this random spot that he stops to set up camp, it becomes a place. It becomes a place that God's people go to meet with him time and time again, not just here, but for Jacob and further into the Old Testament, God's people come back to this place, to Bethel, to the house of God, to meet with God. So maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need a place. Maybe it's a certain room in our house that we go to at the same time each day to do our devotions. Maybe that's what it looks like for us. Or maybe for us, what we need a place like this, like New Life Church, a place where we are committed to come every single Sunday because we know it's a place where we're going to meet with God. But the thing about Bethel, the thing about this place is that it was forgotten as the house of God. Not very far into the Old Testament, God's people, they turned to idolatry and they turned to worship pagan gods. And instead of Bethel being the house of God, it became a house of idolatry and pagan worship. And why did that happen? It happened because God's people forgot that it was a place where God had met with Jacob. They forgot. So we have to go to great lengths. We have to put in the work, just like Jacob does, to make sure that we remember where and when God meets with us. For me, one thing that I find helpful is writing it down. when God does something or when God shows up, is writing it down. And Pastor Ryan Goeden, he actually got me started doing this. I have this journal that's like one line a day. Okay, so it's one line a day, and then it stacks up days for 5 years in a row. So like April 28th, 2024, April 28th, 2025, 2026, and so on for 5 years. And as you complete a year in the journal and you're journaling the next year, you come back to those years where you've written something down. You come back to those years where you remember something God did, something cute that your kids did, a moment that you had with God, what you were praying for, asking God for. And for me, when I write those things down, it helps me remember. I mean, this story, it's written down, right? If we didn't have it written down, we wouldn't be talking about it together here this morning. And like I said, I believe it takes work. I believe it takes work to make sure that we don't forget what God has done. And for me, like one line a day should be really easy, right? But currently, I'm a couple days behind on my little one line a day journal. It takes work, which is exactly what Jacob shows us here in these verses. Now, finally, we get to the last couple sentences of this chapter. And what we see is that Jacob, he not only does he remember what God does, but he responds when God shows up. He responds when God shows up. And there's a little bit of debate about whether he responds in the right way or not. We'll get to that in a minute, but the important part is that when God meets with us, when God meets us, he expects us to respond. Verses 20 through 22. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I'm taking and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God. The stone that I've set up as a pillar will be God's house. And of all that you give me, I'll give a tenth of it back to you, God. Now, you can probably see why this part of the passage is a little bit controversial, because there are some Bible scholars who say that Jacob, he's just being classic Jacob. He's wheeling and dealing and swindling and bargaining with God, trying to manipulate his way into a favorable position with God, right? That's kind of what it feels like. And then God, what he does in his grace is he meets Jacob right where he's at, with his faulty and flawed understanding of how relationship with God works, and God puts up with Jacob's manipulative nature. That God, in his grace, he works with Jacob, even though Jacob is manipulative. And then there's other Bible scholars that say, no, Jacob, he's not being manipulative here. Jacob is being genuine. Jacob is saying, God, I can't do any of these things in this vow unless you provide me with them in the first place, which is it's at least partially true, because Jacob, he's like the picture of homelessness, right? He's sleeping on a rock. He's got nothing. He has nothing. It's sort of like if Jacob was like God's son, and God says, hey, son, you need to clean up your room. And Jacob says, well, Dad, I've got to have a room, and I've got to have toys, and I've got to have a bed to make so that I can clean it up and straighten it up, right? It's almost maybe, according to those other Bible scholars, it's almost like God has to provide in order for Jacob to fulfill this vow. And I don't know which of those two different groups of Bible scholars is correct, but what I do know, the most important part of the last part in this passage is that when God meets with us, he expects us to respond. When God meets with us, he expects us to respond. He expects us to respond in the right way. Not only that, but he equips us to respond in the right way. Because it is true that the only way Jacob can give God a tenth of what he's been given, and the only way that Jacob can return to the land that God has sent him from, the only way he can do any of those things is if God provides. The only way he can do any of those things is if God protects him. The only way he can do any of those things is if God gives him what he's promised to give. It's the only way that it's possible. It's the only way that Jacob is going to be able to respond the right way. And when God expects us to respond, and he expects us to respond the right way to him showing up, I think that's a pretty tall order. It's a tall order because we're just like Jacob, right? We are deceptive and manipulative, and we try to work our way into a favorable position with God, just like Jacob does. Just like Jacob. But the good news is for us that even if we get it wrong, that even if we don't respond to God the right way, that God, he still works with us in his grace. And that God, what he does, just like with Jacob, is he equips us to respond to what he expects of us. God equips us to respond to what he expects of us. So if maybe God has asked us to tell some of our friends about why we put our faith in Jesus, well, he's going to make it happen. He's going to give us the words to say. Maybe God asks us to explain why we decided to get baptized at New Life Church to all of our family who do not have faith in Jesus. God's going to help us make that. He's going to help us make that conversation happen. When God expects something from us, he equips us to do it. And I think that whether Jacob's right or wrong, manipulative or not, he's genuine or not, I think that the way he responds, it's not too far off base. And I think that it's also a bunch of different ways that we can respond. Jacob says, God, you're going to be my God. If you do these things, God, you're going to be my God. I'm going to have a personal relationship with you. It's like Jacob saying, hey, I'm going to get to know Jesus better. He says, God, this is going to be your house. This is going to be a place that I come back to. I'm going to meet with you. This isn't a one-time deal. No, God, this is going to be a relationship that continues and carries on. That's practical for us. And Jacob, he also says, God, I'm going to give you 1/10 of what I've been given. It's called tithing, giving God 10% of what he has entrusted to us. Jacob says, God, I recognize that you're the one who's given it all in the first place. You're the one who owns it. I'm going to live my life open-handed. And God, I'm going to give back to you what you've given to me. It's practical for us. One of the best ways that we can be part of what God's doing at this church is through our faithfulness and through our generosity in giving. What Jacob finds is that when God meets with him, God expects him to respond and God equips him to respond. What we've seen together this morning is that when God meets with us, he meets us in his grace, he meets us right where we're at, and then he goes with us from there. And what I love about this story is that it shows back up later on in the story of Scripture. I love how the Bible's written because sometimes we get foreshadowing here and then we get fulfillment later. I love that the Bible is written as a really good story, that they come full circle. It's exactly what happens with Genesis chapter 28. Genesis 28 tells us that God, he shows up and he meets Jacob right where he's at, and then God goes with Jacob from there. If we follow that story all the way into the New Testament, Jesus himself, he quotes this story in John chapter 1, verse 51. And what does Jesus say? He says, surely you're going to see the Son of Man with angels ascending and descending upon him. What Jesus says is, Jesus says, I am the gate of heaven. Jesus says, I am the house of God. Jesus says, I am the bridge between humanity and divinity. I am the bridge between heaven and earth. And what we find in the final verses of Genesis chapter 28 is the only way that God graciously meets with us right where we're at in our sin, in our depravity, in our dysfunction is through Jesus. And the only way that God goes with us from there is through Jesus, because of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. When we put our faith in him, the very presence of God dwells within us. He goes with us from there. It is only because of Jesus, the house of God, only because of Jesus, the gate of heaven, only because of Jesus, the bridge between heaven and earth, that God can meet us where we're at and that God can go with us from there. So Jesus, this morning, we are thankful for the great lengths to which you've gone to make sure that we can meet with you. And Jesus, this morning, we're asking for your help to make those kinds of meetings happen, to respond the right way when you meet with us, to remember when you meet with us, to understand that sometimes, God, you're going to meet us when we least expect it, that we need to be aware of what you're doing and where you're at work. Jesus, from the truth of your word, help us to understand that you meet us where we are, but you don't let us stay there. From there, God, you go with us. You take us with you, helping us get to know you, Jesus, even better. That's our prayer together this morning, is that, Jesus, we would get to know you better because you've met with us and because you go with us. And Jesus, it's in your name we pray. And everyone said, amen.
Thank you so much for checking us out online today. We hope it was a blessing and an encouragement to your life.
And if you would like to give today, there are two ways you can do so. You can text your amount to 84321, or you can go to giving.nlspringfield.com.
Also, if you are new here, we have Party with the Pastors the first week of each month. We would love to see you there.
We get to know you better, and you get to know us a little better too. And also, we have services every Sunday at 8, 9:30, and 11, and we'd love to see you in person.
We will see you next week.